Good afternoon. On behalf of Engineers Australia, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our Thought Leader series, The Future of Environmental Design. My name is Megan Purdy and I'm from Engineers Australia. Firstly, in keeping with our tradition, Engineers Australia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land and recognises their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to their cultures and to elders past, present and emerging. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that today's webinar is being hosted with Engineers Australia's industry partner, Cardno. Cardno are an ASX-listed professional infrastructure and environmental services company with expertise in the development and improvement of physical and social infrastructure for communities around the world. The Cardno team is comprised of leading professionals who plan, design, manage and deliver sustainable projects and community programs. Their diverse skills and experience allow them to offer integrated services in 10 market sectors to clients both locally and across the globe. These sectors are buildings, land, coastal and ocean, environment, international development, management services, energy and resources, transportation, water and defence. I would now like to welcome our moderator for this afternoon, Mike Cush. Mike joined the Australian Rail Track Corporation in 2020 and is responsible for pre-contract functions such as engagement with state transport agencies, utility agreements, council agreements, property acquisitions and level crossings, policy and application. With more than 40 years' experience as a civil engineer, Mike has held executive and senior management roles in the transport and infrastructure sectors. He is recognised for his expertise in leading and managing the successful delivery of complex projects, providing extensive experience in infrastructure construction and maintenance involving both the private and public sectors. Before joining ARTC, Mike was the Project Director, Transport at Cardno. He has held previous roles as General Manager of Network New South Wales for Roads and Maritime Services and Executive General Manager for Government and Infrastructure Projects with Downer. Please join me in welcoming Mike.
Thanks, Megan, and welcome again to our viewers. I'd like to welcome our speakers for today, Kevin Roberts and Linh Truong. Firstly, Kevin Roberts has over 30 years of experience in the assessment and management of environmental issues, and he provides technical and policy leadership for Cardno's environmental team. Kevin was the Principal Environment Manager for WestConnex Delivery Authority. He had responsibility for establishing the environmental systems of that authority, undertaking their strategic and initial environmental assessments, liaising with regulators, and developing the environmental criteria for design and construction contracts. He's got extensive experience in providing environmental advice for project approvals, for managing environmental incidents, developing restoration and offset strategies, drafting the guidelines and procedures, and delivering training packages. He's worked in senior roles for New South Wales Roads and Maritime Services, now Transport for New South Wales, the Environmental Protection Authority, National Parks and Wildlife, and the Department of Water Resources. He's led the preparation of referrals for many projects requiring consideration or approval under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. By any means, he's an experienced presenter. I'd also like to introduce Linh Truong, who's the Transport Business Leader for Cardno in New South Wales. She leads a team of engineers and planners across bridges, geotech, roads, transport advisory and project management. Her leadership's underpinned by 20 years of experience in developing and delivering multimodal transport projects. Prior to joining Cardno, Linh worked for 14 years with New South Wales Roads and Maritime Services and Roads and Traffic Authority. During that time, she held a number of roles including Project Manager, Senior Project Development Manager in both regional and Sydney locations. And she delivered on the full life cycle of projects from the strategic design to concept design to detailed design and construction. Linh's got a reputation for delivering highly complex stakeholder environments. She's a strong advocate of early engagement. She drives a delivery framework that's inclusive, holistic and values-driven, resulting in cooperative partnerships and stakeholder-supported outcomes for transport projects at both state and federal levels. I've worked with Lynn and Kevin. They're both excellent people and excellent presenters. And please welcome Lynn and Kevin.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Mike. Kevin and I were talking about how much things have changed since we started. When I landed my first postgrad job as a fully fledged engineer at what was then the Roads and Traffic Authority of New South Wales, the focus was squarely on road safety. It was 10 years after the introduction of speed cameras in New South Wales, and around the same time, graduated licensing was introduced. Joining the road design team, road safety was drilled into me. Create more forgiving roads, wider shoulders, bigger clear zones, and rightly so. We're on a mission to reduce road deaths tolls despite a growing population who travelled more than ever before. As a public servant, I took my mission to heart, serve and do good. But what it means for me to do good has evolved and matured, and as I've progressed, but also as the expectations and needs of our world has evolved and progressed. Safe to me has grown beyond reducing accidents, but also includes the community and this place that belongs to them, how they live there, right next to the infrastructure, how they pass through it on their way to work, how their families cope with it, loaded up for a holiday. But it also includes our environment and what we can do now and what we leave behind, and how we can make sure that what we leave behind is better than what we were given. How about you, Kevin?
Thanks, Mike and Lynn. Look, I've worked for over 30 years in the area of environmental management and environmental design. When I started work, that discipline didn't even really exist. And I've worked as, I was called a scientific officer, but I've worked as an advisor, a regulator, a policy maker, a proponent, and an environmental designer. I think things have changed now, and environmental management is now a core part of project development. Just a little story about when I first started, my big boss, who was the chief engineer at the time of the agency, called me into his office and he said, "You scientists are costing us too much money." And then he dismissed me from his office. But I think things have changed. The environmental profession is now well regarded, and I've been lucky enough to work with many project teams who valued my input and have been keen to apply environmental knowledge to projects. The theme of our presentation today really is the idea of changing our thinking of what environmental management in projects actually means. And this is a change that is occurring in industry. So the change is where we move from the concept of environmental compliance, where we meet our approval requirements, we do the check boxes, we do the audits, we make sure things are being done correctly, to focusing on environmental opportunities. And we'll go through that in the presentation. Our agenda is fairly straightforward. Lynn is going to take us through examples of how environmental design issues are considered within project life cycles, and how the environmental management framework applies in infrastructure projects and how it can be improved. I'll return to talk about the broader opportunities for environmental restoration that may come with a changed approach. Thanks, Lynn.
The transport infrastructure development lifecycle can be viewed in two parts. But as the term suggests, they feed back into each other as the infrastructure reaches its useful limits. With the strategic phase, the focus is on defining the project, where trying to ask the right questions, trying to solve the right problems. It defines the shape of the solution, it sets the objectives, and it secures initial fundings to take it to implementation. The implementation phase focuses on the details. We're marrying solutions to the objectives and confirming the benefits before construction and opening. Now, Early in the strategic phase, we have very little information to work from. A problem statement, maybe, and sometimes even that has a lot of flex in it. But it's also where environmental input can make the biggest impact. It can reshape the question, reshape the objectives, reshape the solution. The further along the development life cycle we go, the further down the triangle, the fewer the options and the lower the impact of environmental input. Eventually, it becomes mere compliance. To explain the current framework, I liken these first 3 steps to safety. First, we try to avoid having the issue in the first place. We're asking things like, does the work need to be done? Does it need to be done this way? Can we try something different? When we can't, we then try to minimize the safety hazard. Can we isolate the site, divert the traffic to another route? Can we stage our work to avoid parallel activities sharing the same space? Can we build a different time of day or year when the traffic volumes are lower? Can we mitigate? This essentially means barriers, delineation, PPE. Fortunately, we don't get to offset safety. Within the environmental framework, done right, the question should be largely the same. We should be looking to avoid. We should be asking, does the work need to be done? Does the work need to be done this way? Can we try something different? Extreme examples of avoid might be build a long tunnel instead of a surface road to completely avoid impact on valuable ecosystems. We can ask, can we improve access to and upgrade an existing route rather than creating a whole new corridor? A less visible example might be to simply choose to increase capacity of a corridor via increased public transport instead of adding more lanes. Though not an environmentally driven decision. A great example is that of the Northern Beaches Beeline project, where the corridor capacity was increased with improved bus operations, timetabling, and vehicle capacity with the double-decker buses. The problem is that these great examples are not common because most objectives are defined already. You may have heard similar objectives. At this location, we want 4 lanes, dual carriageway, 3.5 metre lanes, 3 metre shoulders, minimise environmental impacts. Did you hear that? We skipped avoid and went straight to step 2. By the time we get to minimise, we are asking, can we go left, right? Can we narrow the corridor? Can we take a little less of this or that national park? Even so, with the right whole of project team engagement, we can achieve good outcomes. Vic Roads has some great examples in their fauna-sensitive road design guidelines. Here's an example from Quarter 3-way. You can see here, the bridge was lifted, was separated, which allowed the native vegetation underneath to continue to thrive. Great results that benefited from early environmental input before we locked in vertical geometry. Now the next stage down the triangle is mitigate. Here the decision on the amount of ecosystem removal and division has been made. On the Pacific Highway, they have some great examples of land bridges, but I chose these pictures to show you for their apparent simplicity. These are examples of environmental design measures that facilitate movement of both ground dwelling fauna and arboreal fauna. They're simple to look at. Their benefits to native fauna shouldn't be undersold. They keep them safe from the traffic. And to make sure they work as intended, it does require forethought and engineering and design adjustments. For example, culverts shouldn't be in a low point and be filled with water, which means that we do have to adjust the vertical geometry to make this work. With offset, we often find it going hand in hand with mitigate. Here the damage is done, and we're looking for ways to limit that damage. Offset intends to compensate the irreversible damage of significant ecosystems. We're looking for like ecosystems, and we're looking for more of it. We're talking about a multiple of 4 to 10 times the size. We're looking to invest in it and improve it and effectively leave a protected environment in place of the one that we took away. So what's our message to you here? In the traditional environmental framework, we're saying it's too easy to turn it into a regulatory and compliance consistency approach, which leads us down a checkbox-like path, where we're focusing largely on mitigation with limited ability to make significant impacts to the overall. Though offset should be a last resort, it's too often a first resort, with the cost of it just accepted and built into the project economics. We can do better by bringing the project thinking forward to the project scoping phase, and we can focus on avoid and minimize. But today, we'd like to introduce you to the concept of taking it even further. We want to flip the switch from compliance thinking to opportunity thinking. Instead of avoid and minimize, we're asking, what is the environmental opportunity here? So instead of taking a back seat to infrastructure, can environmental projects be the driver? Can infrastructure engineering support and enhance environmental outcomes? Can the objectives be change from minimize or to improve or even create environmental benefits? While we'll ponder this, I'll hand you back to Kevin to talk about the reviews on the current system and what opportunities ecosystem restoration can bring.
Thanks, Lynn. I'm now going to talk about some of the drivers for change. So in 2020, there was a major review of our national environmental laws, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which has been in place for a number of years. This report was fairly forthright, I guess, in its conclusions, and what they concluded was that the laws have not been successful in halting or reversing environmental decline in Australia. The reasons of this that they identified were many, and they include things that are outside of the control of a country such as Australia, such as the broad global climate change. But one of the key things that they pointed the finger at was a lack of focus in the legislation on actions that actually assist in restoring our environment. The review included 3 recommendations among many. The 3 ones that I've picked out to focus on here is that there needs to be a significant investment in programs that reverse environmental decline at the same time enabling future development. That this investment needs to be planned and adaptive and focusing on the right sort of actions that actually lead to the right sort of change. And thirdly, that this investment needs to be collaborative and coordinated. It needs to involve the government, the community, landholders, industry, the Indigenous community. Basically, that the challenge is not just the responsibility of one part of the community, it's a collective responsibility. The second driver, I think, is a recognition that some of our existing frameworks are limited in moving into facilitating restoration and improvement. Lynn's talked about the avoid, the minimise, the mitigate framework. This framework really only applies to individual projects. They're not necessarily tackling what our environmental challenges are. They're tackling environmental management of a particular project. And they may not be the right things to actually spend the money on. They're better off spent in other ways. This article that was in the Sydney Morning Herald only last Saturday is an example. There's a senior member of the government there announcing a review of the New South Wales offset scheme. So if you remember from Lynn's discussion, the offsets were the 4th layer in the environmental management framework, what you do when you can't avoid or minimise or mitigate impacts. The issue they're raising here is the cost of offsets and the uncertainty that it's creating for the Wangla Dam raising project. And it quotes a number of different stakeholders in the article from government, industry and Greens, and whilst all of them have different logic, they're all questioning the value of offsets as a mechanism in delivering environmental outcomes. Offsetting is a particular issue that is creating a number of issues, but it has been very effective in a number of ways. Firstly, it has allowed significant development to occur and provided a means to be able to quantify and compensate for that impact. So it provides an opportunity to measure what your impact is and to measure that if you do something else, how will that compensate for that loss. It also means it places a value on land that contains environments of value. So previously land that on a property may be of no value because it can't be used and it can't be cleared now has a value as an offset, and this is a positive thing in that it values environments in a way that haven't been able to do before. And importantly, I think the understanding of offsetting is not necessarily clear. It doesn't mean not protecting an area and then not clearing an area. It means that the values that are lost from clearing that area are gained through some form of action in terms of restoration elsewhere in the landscape. So it means protecting, managing and actively restoring. The problem in that is that in calculating those offsets, people are realising what the value of the thing that has been cleared in the first place is. So now ratios are jumping up to be more like 10 hectares of offset, including a series of management actions for 1 hectare of clearing. But identifying that improvement may not occur over 20 years and that the offset needs to be secured in perpetuity, which is a challenge. I think what does mean ultimately is that there is a limit to offsetting as the fallback solution, both in terms of availability of land and acceptance of the loss. We're now going to move on to the concept of ecosystem restoration that we foreshadowed. The United Nations has declared the decade 2021 to 2030, the decade on ecosystem restoration. The aim of the decade is to prevent and halt and reverse degradation of ecosystems worldwide. Just going to show you now a quick video prepared by Cardno on how it's responding to this challenge set by the decade of ecosystem restoration. And apologies in advance that the video is a bit of a sales pitch, but we thought that the message that the video has is important, and that is that engineering and environmental consultancies like Cardno and others have to refocus their effort towards restoration. I suspect this is a common corporate theme, not necessarily backed by processes, programs and the required resources.
On June 5th, World Environment Day, the United Nations launched the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, a 10-year effort to halt and reverse the decline of the natural world. As the UN begins this important initiative, Cardno teams across the globe are supporting this push, working on projects designed to restore and protect ecosystems. Our expert technical staff has restored diverse natural habitats around the world, from forests in Papua New Guinea to prairies in Chicago, Illinois, and wetlands in Australia. Challenges created by climate change and habitat loss may seem overwhelming, but the benefits and global reach of our ecosystem restoration projects provide a spark of hope for better decades ahead. These projects are creating healthier, more sustainable and productive environments in and around small towns, villages, and cities across the world. And our commitment to the planet extends beyond our restoration services. Throughout our company, Cardno is aligning our sustainable practices to the UN Sustainable Development Goals to collaboratively work toward the universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and promote peace and prosperity through the next decade.
Thanks, everyone. I think it presents an interesting challenge, and I'm not 100% sure that planting some vegetation will ultimately lead to peace and prosperity, but it's one of those steps that is part of that challenge. In defining that and trying to define it as an engineering challenge. I think the aim is to deliver positive environmental outcomes with projects that are either specifically designed to deliver environmental restoration. There's no other purpose for them other than the goal of restoring a particular environment, or they're environmental restoration outcomes that are integral to an infrastructure project. An example there, and Lynn mentioned this in her earlier discussion, is that the broad objectives for the new road aren't just about minimising environmental impact, but they may be also about re-establishing pathways for wildlife, or they could be about improving water quality downstream. So it's not just the minimise question, it's what can we do beyond that that actually improves the environmental outcomes from the project. We've started to see some of these changes in projects now. There's been a couple of legal rulings that flag this concept of flow-on or unintended consequences, and some of these have played out in terms of activities impacting on the Great Barrier Reef, where the project didn't consider the flow-on or unintended consequences of what that project would be, and it's been ruled that they need to consider that, whether that be the impacts of development that the project may actually bring, not necessarily the development of the project itself, but subsequent development that may impact in terms of water quality on the reef, or in terms of coal mining, what the impact ultimately of carbon burning or emissions have on the future of the barrier reef. So it's an interesting challenge as to how far do we go with assessing what their impact is and where the boundary is. Many of these concepts are not new, and in fact we've been challenged by them for a long time. The example I want to cover here in this discussion, and that we've talked through in a number of our examples, is the idea of restoring movement pathways for wildlife, what we call wildlife connectivity. Wildlife crossings are not new to Australia. In fact, the transport agencies in New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria have been at the forefront of building some of these things and including them in projects, particularly over the last 20 years. And we saw some of those in Lynn's example. This is a picture, and I've deliberately chosen something not from Australia, is an example from the Netherlands, who are a little bit at the forefront of this issue. And there's three ways that you could look at what this project actually is. One is that there was a proposal to build a new multi-lane road, and the mitigation measure was to mitigate the impact of that on wildlife by building this large land bridge concept, so that the wildlife can move unhindered from one side of the road corridor to the other. So that might have been one of the reasons that it was built. The second reason might have been that there was an existing wildlife connectivity problem there from an existing road, and there was a project to add an extra lane to the road, and as part of that project there was a decision to improve the wildlife outcomes. So it's taking an existing project and saying, well, instead of just mitigating the impact, we're actually going to move and improve an outcome for something that has already been lost. So there was an existing barrier caused by the existing road, but the new project's actually moving it. So it may have been that. The third alternative is that it's got nothing to do with the road project at all. In fact, the construction of the land bridge is part of a comprehensive plan to choose the areas where wildlife connectivity in the landscape needs to be improved. So it's a comprehensive plan where sites are prioritised based on wildlife needs and not actually tied to the project. Clearly this needs to be supported by funding and government programs and all of that sort of stuff. But this has actually been the case in the Netherlands and a couple of other countries in Europe, where they've looked at their landscape and they've looked at where there is roadkill in the landscape, where there is reductions in habitat, and it's affecting the survival of populations. And they've identified where are the right places to put these sorts of structures and then building in the landscape. So it's actually an active goal of the restoration project. We haven't quite got there in Australia yet, but I think we're starting to see some evidence of these sorts of projects, which require considerable design skills and thought and budget and all the sorts of things that are done with standard infrastructure being applied to the concept of environmental restoration. And the same principles may also apply to other sorts of projects. You might think of a bridge construction project and works to improve the habitat quality or the water quality in a river. Similarly, projects that affect the Great Barrier Reef and how projects may actually work to improve the quality there rather than just about minimising those sorts of impacts. So I think it's an interesting example and worth, if you're interested in looking it up, if you just look up on the website, Netherlands wildlife crossings, it'll come up with all of the pictures and details of these sorts of programs. And they're quite interesting in the terms of the different scales and complexity of what's proposed. So as a result of all of this, and it was mentioned in the video about global sustainability frameworks, and the United Nations similarly has a series of sustainable development goals that cover a whole range of things about social responsibility, peace and conflict, but they also include goals to improve water quality and to improve land habitats. And a lot of the companies that we work for putting out policies that commit to these frameworks and commit to some of those goals. And what those frameworks are doing are actually requiring us to give evidence of the sorts of things that we're doing to meet those goals, recording our energy use, evaluating the projects that we work on. And in a similar sense, at a national level, the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia program of sustainability reporting does a similar sort of thing, selects a series of indicators that people need to report and demonstrate that they're, to achieve the highest rating, is that you're not just doing business as usual, you're going beyond and demonstrating your achievement for a project in terms of sustainability. The danger, of course, with these is that the same problem that we've had with the broader environmental management frameworks, they become the tick box exercises. But it's important that we do consider those and see what value we can get about committing to these sorts of global sustainable development goals. Some local examples, as I said, are starting to happen, where projects are going beyond just tying into a particular infrastructure project and looking at the landscape and coming up with ecosystem goals. So even in Greater Sydney, amongst all of the district plans that they're putting out, there are goals and targets and actions in these plans around tree canopy cover within the urban areas, with the goal of not only an aesthetic goal, but also the goal of reducing impacts of climate change on people who are living in those environments, and also providing for wildlife connectivity. The draft Cumberland Plain Conservation Plan, which again is in Western Sydney, is a new plan that's still, I think, under consideration. But interestingly, whilst it proposes a framework for urban growth within there, it's also about how do we, across the whole basin, plan for the conservation of the Cumberland Plain ecological communities. And includes recommendations for creating things like a koala reserve and retrofitting these sorts of crossing structures that we've talked about across some of the main roads so that koalas can move across a landscape that's a mix of natural and urban. So I think there are some local examples that are being developed where the principles that we've talked about are being considered. So in terms of summarising up, I think the key messages that we've talked about and hopefully highlighted in the presentation is that the successes that we've had in improving environmental outcomes using the project development cycle can be demonstrated, but can be improved upon by engaging that environmental expertise early, particularly around that discussion of avoid and avoiding those impacts in the first place. We've also, I think, noted that the general environmental design philosophy of avoid, minimise, mitigate and offset is now being challenged a little bit, that it's not enough, and particularly as the limits of offsetting are being realised. I think the other key message around project objectives is that we should be moving from already the objective of the project to minimise our impact on the environment to being how the project improves environmental outcomes, and given some examples of those. We then switched to a global focus, particularly with the decade of ecosystem restoration now upon us, and this is because of the challenges facing us at a global level around climate change and degradation. So the increase in the global focus on these matters is going to filter down to the work that we all do as we work both locally and globally. And importantly, and I think important for the group of people who are on this conference call, multidisciplinary thinking will be required, and it would be great to have a focus of the energy of the members of Engineer Australia to plan, design, implement and be active in the larger scale restoration projects that are going to require the sorts of skills that are involved in building a road or building a rail network or an urban area in achieving restoration goals. And thanks for that. Lynn, just to check to see whether you've got any additional comment to add to these messages. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. The message that calls out to me is the change away from minimise impact to improve outcomes. I think tucked away in there is a call to action to all the engineers, scientists, planners and practitioners, all of us who have a role in building and shaping our built environment, as in a sense, this is an area where we have some control. I think regardless of the project, the scope or the objectives that are handed to us, we should have a look at it and think, well, that's great, but can we do better than that? I think there is a movement to do better, and it's incumbent on us to take up that challenge. With that, I'll hand us back to Mike. Thank you, Engineers Australia. Thank you, Kevin. I'm looking forward to question time.
Thanks very much to Kevin and Lynn for a thought-provoking and challenging presentation. Our speakers will now come together to take questions. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so via the chat box, and please ensure that you give us your name and who you'd like to direct the question to. We did receive some questions on registration, which we'll begin with. So I'll start with a nice easy question for both of them. The idea of broadening objectives for projects to include improved environmental outcomes is laudable, but won't it just raise the cost of projects? And if so, who pays?
Thanks, Mike, for that question. You sound like my old original boss, you know, that we're costing you too much. And no change comes for free, I guess. There's probably been a number of attempts, I think, to calculate what these additional costs of meeting environmental objectives might be. But none of these, I don't think, have been particularly successful because they've focused on a particular environmental design element isolated from the whole project. You know, how much does that koala crossing cost if you did it by itself versus what is it as part of the bigger project? How much does that land bridge cost? How much does it cost for that extra land, and doesn't consider the whole things that we've been dealing with here about minimising impact or reducing offsetting and all of those sorts of things. So I think the consideration of the cost has to consider those things around offsetting and externalities. I probably can go back in helping to answer that question, those three options that I sort of discussed earlier. One is the goal of the project to minimise impact. And a lot of the things that we've been talking about in terms of environmental design are now standard practices in construction. So they're not things that are new things that people need to cost in. They should be part of the design and construction of a project. And the way to save costs in implementing those things is to consider how they're built into the project at the earliest possible stage, as Lynn talked about. So early consideration and collaborative design works there, I think, to help reduce those costs. And it's much easier to factor something into the construction of a project rather than add it on at the end, or when the government regulator comes back and says, hey, you've missed something here, you need to change the way you're doing things. The second one was that option where we talked about instead of just minimising our impact, are we trying to improve our outcomes? So we're trying to do something more than just the minimum there. And again, it's much less costly to do these things if you bring them into the objectives of the project than applying them retrospectively. Again, it's about considering what the objectives of the project are and what are the opportunities, and to help reduce other costs such as offsetting as well. The third one, I guess, is probably where the costs do come in, Mike, and that's where we're doing specific programs to deliver outcomes that actually facilitate environmental improvement. So they're projects that aren't really part of the infrastructure project. They're a separate series of programs, and those ones really do require a government and industry commitment to do these sorts of things. So they have to be valued and justified in their own program. So the costs and benefits of doing this sort of work, cost to the environment, the cost of building the project, doing the program, are all important considerations. But we've done that before in terms of things like the waste levy being imposed and being used as a fund to support environmental programs. But they could also be delivered as goals in terms of meeting our ESG commitments or ISCA goals at a smaller scale. So a project that is delivering something may want to leave some form of legacy of environmental restoration, and that could be one way of funding and delivering that. At the same time, I think we have to recognise that doing things differently does have a cost, and we have to make the judgment call as to whether that's worth spending the money on.
Thanks, Kevin. I've got a question here from Helen in Queensland, which I'll direct to Lynn. How can universities better prepare engineering students to meet sustainability and resilience goals?
Thanks very much, Mike. That's a great one. Within universities, where I'm actually seeing some really good things come out of it. When we're speaking to university students or graduates now, you can see that they really are attacking multidiscipline level type projects. You know, they've got some really interesting avenues by which to get some applied learning. One of the ways, though, that comes to mind that I think there's an opportunity to actually take and question something that is real and has been delivered or has been assessed out there, that's out in the public. So, for example, if you were to pick up a review of environmental factors that's publicly available for a major road corridor, you know, pick something complex, longitudinal, that has some significant impacts. Those kinds of projects actually go through quite a rigorous assessment process, and it takes the view of environment as being quite multidisciplined. You know, we're looking at traffic, we're looking at noise, we're looking at visual, socioeconomic, as well as impacts on ecology, environment, flora, fauna, all those aspects. And perhaps pick up one of those documents and challenge and say, well, you know what? If you were to change that objective, and I guarantee the objective is probably going to say something like minimize environmental impacts. If you were to change that objective, set that challenge and say, well, change it to improve environmental outcomes, but deliver this project. How would you go about it? And encourage that mindset and that kind of thinking, I think, during university would be, rather than accepting everything as a natural constraint, would be a great way to start.
Can I just add something there, Mike? Or,
if you like.
Just it's been a long time since I studied at university, and I'm not sure how the engineering courses are run now, but when I did my degree, I remember I did a science degree, not an engineering degree, but in some of our courses, we had some engineers come across as part of their electives and joined in into those sorts of courses, but I'm sure it's more built into it now. But I guess what I can stress is the value of interdisciplinary working. So the engineers and the scientists working on projects that where they learn from each other, and you come up with an improved goal because of the understanding that comes between the two different disciplines. There is a different way of thinking between the two disciplines, and I think that the more that there's experience in working together, the better the outcome would be.
Thanks, Kevin. I'll follow up with another question to you, Kevin, if you don't mind, and this is from Caitlin in Victoria. Is there anyone developing a sustainable and profitable way to utilise waste materials, such as plastic, in construction in Australia?
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Caitlin. That's not my area of expertise, but my answer would be yes. There are lots of business and government entities that have established methods of using waste material in construction. I'm sure there's people on this call who know all about some of that. The idea is having some sort of closed loop or circular economy of materials. It's got a lot of momentum over the last 10 years or so. And some factors in sort of leading towards that have been things like the Australia's National Waste Policy Action Plan. In 2019, China making the decision not to accept our recyclable wastes in 2018, the ongoing implementation of Green Star and ISCA tools. So my sustainability guru has given me a couple of examples of this, which I guess people can go and talk to about it. But down as I think Reconafalt, an asphalt mix that uses recycled materials, Cleanaway, establishing plastics recycling facilities in Melbourne. Repurpose It, again another downer product, operating construction demolition in Melbourne. Sewers using alternative fuel sources derived from waste. So I think there is a lot of companies that are doing that sort of work, and much more than I can mention. I'm assuming there's a lot more to be done, but there are a lot of examples out there already in that regard. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Kevin. Following on from that, and I'm afraid you're going to get a follow-up question, Kevin. Anurag in New South Wales has asked, can Engineers Australia, and perhaps it's can or should Engineers Australia, push for minimum mandatory use of recycled construction material up to, say, 50% in construction?
Yeah, well, I guess it's not my job to advocate for what Engineers Australia needs to do in terms of their standards, and I think that relates Engineers Australia making a decision how it relates to the policy and how it thinks it can influence industry and government. Suffice to say, I guess the things like the ISCA rating tools or the green buildings tools do actually push for those sorts of things in terms of mandating minimum requirements for recycled content. But you could also argue around areas that I'm more familiar with in terms of standards for the design things that we've talked about in the presentation today. Is it something that we should be having a standard to maximise or have a basic level of wildlife connectivity across an infrastructure project, or what the role of broad standards, I think, in environmental management is something that's really important and needs to be developed. It's really hard, but it's a common thing within infrastructure projects to have standards for safety and for design and for life cycle and all of that sort of stuff. And I think the environmental area could benefit by having more established standards, and there already are some there around water quality management and the use of said ponds and things like that. But I think a push more generally to improve our baseline standards is in terms of broader environmental management is a critical part of being able to move forward.
Thanks, Kevin. So now I'm going to ask a question to both of you, and this is from Margaret in New South Wales. In Australia, it seems that environmental change is being led by business rather than government. What's your experience, and how do we stand against our international colleagues?
Lynn, do you want to go first, or you want me?
Yeah, I'll go first. That's a solid question. I'd say that, and I'll throw over to Kevin too, because I think, Kevin, you've probably got the international perspective here, is that wherever it comes from, for it to be a success, it generally comes from both, where private sector businesses show the will, and they have the will because businesses are responding to their customers' expectations of them. That's generally where it comes from, because businesses seek to satisfy the needs of the customers, the wants of the customers, but also that they see that there is economic financial merit to what is happening. The government's role within that is to create the framework, the policy, the incentive for it to be a success. So it's really a marrying of the two. So when we talk about drive, it can be who's taking the first step. So if we look at environment from its initial setup, where we started to go down the road of reviewing environmental outcomes for projects and putting in place the framework we have now, that was a government-driven policy responding to the expectations of the community. But to take the next step and to do what we're talking about doing now, which is absolutely flipping the switch and investing more into the environment and giving more back to the environment, absolutely, that's going to take a huge drive from both sectors, I'd say. Kevin?
Yeah, Lynn, no, I agree with you. I don't think I'd want to downplay the role of government. In fact, the reason that I got a job in the first place way back was because government had introduced legislation requiring the impacts of projects to be assessed, the Environmental Planning Assessment Act back in 1979. So I think government's been an important driver, and Lynn has covered a few of those, but in terms of assessment of impacts, in terms of approving projects, in terms of compliance with conditions of approval, in terms of providing that funding for the restoration projects that we've talked about, I think government will continue to have a strong role. But in terms of implementing more rapid change, and I think we're in a stage, particularly in terms of global sustainability and the challenges, the environmental challenges of climate change, where more rapid change is required and new approaches are required. I think this goes beyond government and moves to industry. And I guess one of the advantages of industry is that it can operate multinationally. So we're not reliant on waiting for government to make a call, that we can go and implement things more broadly and internationally without having to wait. But they could be innovations in terms of design or building. They could be in terms of efficient use of resources. They could be in terms of choices made for materials use and particularly in that role that I talked about earlier about industry developing standards that become more the baseline for what we do. I guess I don't know a huge amount about how we would compare with overseas, other than working for a company that works overseas. And it seems to me that we're all grappling with the same sorts of things. We're all going through the processes of recognising the challenges of improving environmental outcomes as companies that work across boundaries, and then applying those in the individual circumstances. But I suspect we're probably, in those sorts of terms, in a similar situation to Europe and North America. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. Just looking at the time and the number of questions that are coming in, you're certainly generating lots of questions, so hopefully we've got time to get through them all. Dr. Subaraj has asked a question of you, Kevin, in terms of resilience. Has any modelling been done to come up with a factor of safety for climate change impacts?
Yeah, this is stretching my level of expertise a little bit. It certainly seems to be an emerging feature, I guess, in our natural disaster resource planning and the concept of resilience. I chaired, involved in the New South Wales environmental, the IANZ, Environmental Institute of Australia and New Zealand last week, where we had the new Director General of Resilience New South Wales come and talk to us about how the focus of that agency is about that broader building of resilience for things that are affecting climate change, like flooding, like bushfire, and those sorts of things. And the focus is very much on resilience in terms of impacts to those sorts of events as they occur. Translating that back to safety, I guess, is more the engineering question, I guess, and difficult to model and measure when we have so much variability in our systems and how we manage safety. You include warning systems. Is it the ability for people to move away from that disaster? Is it about the emergency services? Is it about just generally responding to the higher than average temperatures and the new safety challenges that brings? So I don't think I really have an answer there about modelling, because it's not something that I'm familiar with, but I'm sure there's people in this room who do that as their bread and butter.
Thanks, Kevin. I'll ask Lynn to lead off in the response to this next question, and give you a breather, Kevin, but you can certainly make comments afterwards. This is a question from Nikita. Could you both please touch base on sustainability with respect to building services engineering?
Thanks for that one, Nikita. The simple go-to answer would be, looking for ways to develop self-sufficient design within buildings, so that it's supplying its own recycled water, it's supplying its own energy. But I think where I'd actually prefer to approach this from, and it's very much what we covered during our presentation, is that a really good or a great outcome is when multidisciplines come together, when you bring building services engineering with structural engineering and architecture and design, and you bring it all together with the joined and collective objective to come up with a better solution. So the best buildings that you'll see are buildings that are self-sustained, but they're self-sustained not only because they have really smart technologies and smart use of energy and power and ways to collect it and deliver it within, but it's actually got smart design because it's a building that doesn't require as much energy or power to sustain itself, or does not require as much water, or is self-sufficient in other ways. So I would love to see that when a building project comes to play, can a building, and there are examples all around the world of buildings that take zero draw of energy from the grid, but even more that could it start supplying? Could it start supplying its neighbors? Could it actually start to create a better environment so that it's not so much of a heat sink for its surrounding areas, and actually improve the well-being of the whole area that it occupies?
I guess my interest in this question is not so much about the design of the buildings themselves, and it's about how the natural systems are better integrated into built environments. And I think in my presentation I talked about some of the greening programs in central Sydney and Western Sydney, and how do you develop urban areas whilst maintaining the basics of natural systems, of having habitat within urban environments, of having clean water coming from urban environments. And I think that's a challenge, and I think as Sydney develops, it's one of the cities that is growing. It's growing into landscapes that were farmland or natural systems, and there's a lot of really good words in the strategies and plans around how we better integrate into the natural environment. But I think the ability to maintain those natural systems is not just a matter of leaving bits and pieces of creekline or vegetation untouched. It has to be something that's actively managed and designed as part of the development of those urban architectures and urban systems.
Thanks. The next question is one that I'm really interested in, because I've been a client, I've been a service provider, and I've been an advisor. And this is one for you, Lynn, from Jess Radevsky. Is there a way to have a conversation with clients to bring back the avoid step?
To answer that question, you'd probably have to consider two things. One, well, what stage is the project in? So is it a strategic phase, or are we talking about detailed design? Because that's going to influence whether or not that question is possible in terms of actually avoiding. The second thing to keep in mind, and this is probably an important step in developing an opportunity and a rapport to actually have the conversation, is you need to keep in mind that by the time a project comes to you as a service provider, it's been through years of development, potentially. Sometimes, depending if it's large-scale public infrastructure, we might be talking about decades of development. So the project hasn't come out of nowhere to get to a service provider's desk. So if you were to come in and just say, look, I think you've asked the wrong question, you might not get the result that you want. But there are ways to have it. So if the project is in the strategic phase, I wouldn't recommend saying let's re-ask the question at detailed design. But if it is in the earlier phases, there is an obligation, especially on public infrastructure type jobs, to answer the project and justify the projects in terms of not only the why, because we as engineers we tend to obsess over it. Hey, we have a solution. This is why it's awesome. But actually focus also on the why not. And that's actually a really gentle way to have that conversation, because in the holistic assessment of a project and in the holistic understanding of why this is or why not this is the best outcome for the community as a whole, you need to be able to ask those harder questions, such as, well, why haven't we considered this, and why haven't we considered that? Now, the answer still might not change the whole landscape of the project, but it certainly starts to introduce the idea of, well, have we considered avoiding X, Y, Z instead of, so have we, we've gone left instead of right, we've gone right instead of left, or we've gone to 4 lanes instead of improving public transport, for example. And if it's early enough in the project and you're having that kind of holistic conversation, it can certainly feed into a very different outcome. that would be the way I would do it, especially if it's in the earlier stages. Now, if it's in the later stages, perhaps you can't avoid, as in you can't change that the project needs to go from A to B, and there are certain features of the projects that are unavoidable. But I'd bring you back to that challenge that we set towards the end of our formal presentation, which is, can we ask a different question, or can we challenge ourselves to, okay, well, yes, there will be some impacts, but can we actually improve the overall outcome? So that comes into the engineering design challenge, which is, can we take something that evidently will remove some part of the ecosystem or have some sort of impact, but rather than accept and minimize that impact, can we put something back, or can we alter our design that in a way that actually enhances the overall product? And that's really the next step, and that's really the challenge that we need to have a look at.
Kevin?
I'd always just go back to them and say, if you don't do this, you're going to be stuck with an offset bill. You might want to have a relook at what you're proposing. That's always a helpful question.
Fair enough. One of my tricks is, and you've both seen me do this, is to ask a project team or ask the client, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What's the issue you're trying to resolve? And interestingly, you generally get different answers from different people. Moving on, and this is another one to you, Kevin, and this is from George. Are there issues in taking an enhanced environmental approach as you're still changing the environment from a natural state?
Yeah, just looking at that question, I think it's a little bit of a philosophical question there, is it? Should we be focusing on restoration while we're still damaging our environment from all of the projects that we're doing? I guess my first point would be this concept of what is a natural state. You know, Australia's landscape is being managed and modified for 40,000 years or so by the various land managers that have been involved in that, from the our First Nations sort of communities are active environmental management. So the idea that there's a natural state and an unnatural state, I think is a challenging one. I think what we've got is a whole series of ecosystems and ecosystem functions that we're trying to maintain. So we're trying to maintain habitat for species. We're trying to allow wildlife to move. We're trying to maintain our water quality or improve our water quality. I think we've got to recognise that the environment is going to be constantly changing, and part of the reason why we now have to be active in restoration is in response to both the impacts of change that's occurred over the last couple of 100 years, or the impacts that are going to occur because of things that are outside our control, or largely outside our control, like climate change. So I think the challenge of ecosystem restoration, I think, is still a challenge, even if we're still having impacts from our population growth and our development. And partly some of that is about restoring things that we've done, but also responding to the challenges that are coming from those external, I guess, environmental threats.
Thanks for that. Lynn, the next one's going to come to you. It's from David Climey. How can engineers and project developers promote solutions leading to better environmental outcomes when environmental impacts are hard to measure and are insignificant in the scheme of things, and when wider stakeholders don't care about anything other than the bottom line cost? For example, clearing of land to make way for development. It's a nice easy one for you, Lynn.
Don't come any easier, Mike. Thanks very much for that, David. We'll approach this answer in a way that, I hope gives some perspective on the question that you're asking, but perhaps might not get quite where you want me to be, but let's give this a go. There was a question earlier about the role of government and businesses. So as engineers and project developers in the private sector, there's and if we were serving a private sector client, there is a need from the client side to see that there is value in this. And as you said, it's difficult to measure and therefore might seem insignificant in the scheme of things. And if you were to look at the bottom dollar, it wouldn't quite work out or might not work out. And so what we're really relying on is a want and a will, which can certainly get change in some ways, but it probably wouldn't take us all the way there. Now, if I were to come back to that discussion about that role and what Kevin said, the role of government in doing something like this, I might take my example back to that example of safety that I gave you during the presentation. When I first started having a look at projects 20 odd years ago, we were assessing the value of life back then. It's something in the order of, I think, $700,000, maybe even less. And so when we were looking at road safety type projects, it was actually even hard to justify a black spot. People were dying, but we kept looking at the economic merit of delivering a job and saying, oh, well, the economic merit's there, there hasn't been enough deaths, which is insane, right? And that has evolved over time. A few years later, it's $1,000, and then it was a few years later, it was $1 million, and it was $4 million. It's been a while since I've actually had a look at the economic. So I'm not sure where it's up to now, but it's been growing. In addition to that, what people have now started to look at when we're looking at safe system design, we're actually looking at the risk, not only that lives have been taken, but we no longer need that historic data. We're actually looking at the risk to life. So what I'm saying is that we've taken over a journey of valuing something where I guess at some point went, it's kind of perhaps small in the scheme of things. Is there an acceptable risk to life? To now us saying, no, actually, no, we're aiming for zero. We're aiming for zero risk to life. That's what we need, and that there is a willingness to pay for it because we have matured the way that we look at the economy and the benefits to the economy, not only of the singular life itself, but the impact that life has on the economy as a whole, that impact that life has on the society as a whole. And so we're in a way in the infancy, but that offset step was a really important step. It was us saying there is value to an ecosystem, and with that value there has been attributed price. So for me, that is a first important step in giving economic merit to the value of environment. What we're talking about here is saying let's take that further, and Kevin started to touch on it with those sort of the cost of perhaps we need to start pricing the cost of unintended consequences and related things, so actually taking a wider view. And as we start to do that, the economic balance of benefit to cost starts to even out. So why we're relying right now on a will to do better, that my hope is that will slowly transform into a framework that will actually be able to demonstrate what we can do and when we do better and the cost benefit of that.
Kevin, did you want to add to that?
No, Lynn's answered that perfectly.
Okay, then one more for you, Kevin, and this is from Danswell Stars. If legislation hasn't been successful in protecting species and loss of habitat, as illustrated in the Samuels review, why would we conclude that offsetting has been effective? Aren't we supporting unsustainable development?
Yeah, I saw that that question just then, and I guess the premise of it, I think, I'd challenge. I guess firstly, I think legislation has been successful in protecting some species and in protecting loss of habitat. The amount of habitat clearing and things that are going on now is far less than what was occurring previously. I think there's been huge advances in the way we undertake projects to reduce our impact on protected species and habitats. But I think the overall conclusion, I think that Samuel's came from, that's all been great, but it's still not stopping that broader decline. And some of those are for reasons beyond loss of habitat and the fact that there needs to be active restoration, I guess, and active management of species and habitat. That's the first part of the question. The second part concluded that offsetting has been effective. I'm not sure that I concluded that. I think I concluded that offsetting has been valuable for a number of reasons. One is that it's created a value for offset land on particularly on private property. So because people need to purchase offsets, that there is now a value on it. So it's created something that didn't exist before. But I think my broader conclusion there was that there's a limit effectively to what offsetting can achieve. And I think we need to recognise that limit. And the discussion that we've had right throughout this talk is about that hierarchy of avoid, minimise, mitigate and offset, is that the offsetting stuff is what you wanted to be doing last of all, not as your first choice. So effectively, if we're designing projects and delivering projects where we've considered all those sorts of things, then the role of offsetting would only be a very small part of that. And I guess if we're doing that, then perhaps the development, by definition, the fact that we've managed to avoid and minimise becomes less unsustainable, and therefore we're supporting development that's more sustainable than what it previously would have been. So I think, sorry, I don't know if I've quite answered your question there, Dansel, but sort of unpacked it a little bit and looked at it a little bit differently there. So perhaps we can turn that around to say if we do things and we change the way we do things, then maybe our development will be more sustainable. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. Following on from that, and I think this question's appropriate for both of you, and I might let Lynn go first. And this is from Jess Radevsky again, and it's following on about offsetting. Is it up with offsetting? Is it up to the company or project manager to ensure their offsets are sustainable and healthy throughout the years, or is it left to nature's will?
I actually think I might hand this one over to Kevin.
Thanks, Lynn.
No problems.
Well, the offsetting framework that's set up in legislation requires someone to be responsible for ensuring that the offset achieves its objectives. I think Lynn had a slide up early on which showed that an offset is comprised of protecting things that are otherwise not protected and implementing a range of actions that lead to improvements in ecosystems. So those sorts of things are things like undertaking weed control or managing feral animals, all of those sorts of things. So by definition, to achieve an offset, you can't just say, I'm not going to touch this area of land. You have to have some form of system that actively manages that. So the offsetting framework in New South Wales and in other states is always quite complex, and there's all sorts of different mechanisms that deal with that. One is that you set up the offset, but then you hand it over to someone else who's then obliged to manage it and meet those requirements and report through to an institution that makes sure that the requirements are being met. So in New South Wales, you've got the Biodiversity Conservation Trust, which is set up to effectively audit that those objectives are being met. So whether it's the company that has had the impact, and often companies who have impacts don't want to be long-term offset managers. They would hand over that responsibility by either selling the offset or purchasing the offset off a private landholder, who then takes up the obligation to meet those requirements. So no, it's definitely not left to nature's will, although there's a number of things that if you leave things alone, nature will do the job. And it's a complex arrangement, which adds to the cost of offsets, of making sure that the improvements that have been promised as part of that offsetting are actually occurring, often for commitments of up to in perpetuity, effectively. So it's not a set and forget thing at all. So I hope that answers that question, Jess.
Okay, I'm just looking at time, and we're getting towards the end of the webinar. There's a question here that I'll put to Lynn. It's from Pani Yiotti. It's common for most engineers to use design codes such as Australian standards as a tool for infrastructure design. How would environmental factors affect how we use these codes of practice into the future?
There are elements of the code that will continue to play a vital role and will only change as the science of science changes. So the aspects of the code that relate to safety and how it responds to the standard the standard sciences that do not change with physics, that won't shift. But where it will start to shift is that if we start to think about climate change, we start to think about the more potentially unforgiving environments that start to play out in this, you will start to see a change in the code, and we have started to see it already. So, for example, when we look at drainage engineering and you look at opening sizes for pipes or culverts, there is a factor in there. There is a factor in there for climate changes in there. When we look at the assessment of the cost of construction, there is a greenhouse gas calculation that plays out when we're assessing the impact of construction and the staging and the kind of equipment that's used. That all plays out. So what you will start to see is the standards will need to start shifting and evolving to take into account the different conditions that the infrastructure might be subjected to. So bridges is probably a really good example of that. When you look at bridges and we look at the variability in climate conditions and the extreme climate conditions, an example might be not only the end state, but the interim state, so the construction, during the construction staging. Historically, we would look at construction staging, we would look at the kind of equipments that are being used, how the infrastructure is being propped, and how it's behaving during construction. But we're not actually looking at its end state in terms of debris resistance. But if it's a bridge over a river, and we take into account extreme weather variability and the higher potential for flash flooding, and along with that, increased size of debris washing down the river, suddenly we're introducing a new element to design. And again, it's actually starting to see quite a bit of this take into account, because we've actually had examples of it where we actually have to consider, in the engineering state, during construction, during a temporary state, we have to consider the forces of environmental impact, and along with that, everything that comes with it. And that not only includes the main structure, but all the temporary structures, the scaffolding, and all those things that we have in place, the cranes and whatnot, during construction. So I hazard, and I don't write Australian standards, and I haven't, but that is certainly an evolving area, and that's going to impact and start to change, and it actually has already started to change and continue to change the standards that we're working with.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Kevin. Look, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to paraphrase one of the questions and put it to both of you, so that you can wrap up. What do you think is the biggest contribution an engineer can contribute to face the current environmental issues? Kevin, you can go first.
Good question. I think it's about the engineering profession being active in environmental management and environmental restoration, and bringing forward the ideas as to actually how to achieve these sorts of goals. We've seen lots and lots of programs run by scientists or policymakers that fail because they don't have the discipline and the rigour to actually achieve the outcomes on the ground. So I think it's bringing the discipline and the thinking to actually the environmental field, and not just the environment field as an add-on to the infrastructure field, but in terms of delivering outputs and outcomes that actually lead to that environmental improvement. That needs the skills of the engineering profession to be both active and positive in making those things happen.
Thanks. Lynn, what do you think?
It's hard to top that one, Kevin. I'd be along the same lines in that the amazing thing, and why I entered the engineering profession, why I still stay in it, is this overwhelming desire and excitement that we get when we solve a really cool problem. I'd state that this is a really interesting, difficult, but also imperative problem that we have to come together as an engineering profession to solve. So time and time again, and we've seen examples within farming, we've seen example within building design, we've seen examples that Kevin was showing us in the Netherlands, where engineering came and said, actually, we can do something that's innovative. We can do something that at the end of the day will improve the natural environment, will reduce the need for water, will reduce the need for air conditioning or heating, will reduce the need for fencing because we're eliminating roadkill, and actually show that through smart engineering design we can actually provide a financial and economic benefit. And that really starts to get people thinking. We do it for the love, so other people assess us for the economic merit, and so that's our challenge: how to do things smarter, how to do things better, how to work collaboratively together beyond our technical expertise in our field, and actually bring a team together of like minds with a set objective to actually come out with a better solution than what we started with.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Kevin. Look, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like everyone online to join me in thanking Kevin and Lynn for their effort, their insights, and their competence, and the nature that in the way they've gone about presenting the information today. It's been thought-provoking, it's been challenging, and as engineers, it should have enthused us to really rethink and challenge our thinking about environmental design. I'd like to thank Engineers Australia's partner Cardno for making today's webinar possible. We'd appreciate your feedback on the program today to help us improve and plan future sessions. If you'd please complete the short feedback form, which is linked in the description box below. And thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you.